All right. Hello, everyone. So in today's video, I'm gonna talk a little bit about motion setting positioning. Which is something that AdjCores usually do when they are discussing motions and preparing for the tournament. Because what AdjCores do is that they not only make the motions, refine them, nuance them, they also decide where they are going to be positioned throughout the tournament. And so that's a complex process. It's a very um well thought process. It should be a well thought out process. And hopefully, as a debater, if you're watching this video, you're not only able to appreciate a lot of the hard work that AdjCores do, but for your own sake, it helps a lot to, not be led by the tournament in terms of the randomness of the different topics, but you could also anticipate and predict what AdjCores are trying to do and how they're structuring a tournament so that you're able to eventually be a little bit more mentally prepared for what's going to happen next. So there is some theory to it. There is some thought and some critical evaluation. And so let's get right into it. So this set of motions is from a recent tournament that I AdjCored along with Ben and Vinod. So this is the Hong Kong Debate Open in 2024. And the target market of this tournament were mostly high school students, some university students, but mostly high school to middle school students from ages from under 14 to under 16 to under 18. So from the very beginning, the level and quality of motions that are going to be set are expected to be on a relative broad novice to experienced high school level, and not to say that the motions are not good or that they are not difficult. It is to say that when you are positioning the motions and you are thinking about what will happen throughout the rounds and how that will affect different types of debaters, well, that is a consideration in motion setting as well, the target market. And so, in this tournament, it was a challenge because you had a wide range of, very, very, very excellent, some of the best debaters in high school, in Asia, and in the world. And you had some of the, like younger, willing, beginner debaters that are just starting out but have a lot of potential. Maybe they're well read, maybe they might be experienced in other formats. And so it's a matter of testing the waters and seeing how it works out throughout the tournament. So, game, let's begin. So, when you are positioning motions across the tournament, and this is with the relative assumption that you have assessed those motions, you've tested them, you know what are the certain themes and arguments that would come in certain motions and clashes that would come out, and then you know that certain motions are more comprehensive, they are more complicated, they are more difficult, they are relatively more balanced, some are relatively more experimental, some are relatively more accessible or known by debaters and they've done this before in training, and some of them might not have done certain nuances in certain motions, but they might be able to do that, and maybe we have to think about where we should position these motions. So this broadly, I would summarize this in a few points. The first would be round progression. So what I mean by round progression is that you first think, what are the motions you would likely set in round 1? What are the motions you would likely set towards round 7? And what are the motions you would likely set uniquely and exclusively for the out rounds? So usually, this decision will involve acknowledging that throughout a tournament that is power matched, round 1 compared to round 7 is going to have a vast different level within each and every room. For example, round 1, relatively random, there will be a huge variance within those rooms, and in round 7, it is relatively more likely that the rooms that are going to be facing each other are the ones that are relatively balanced or power matched with each other. So, and that's across the entire tournament, right? Which means bin rooms face each other, and bubble rooms face each other, and high rooms face each other. So, when you think about round progression, what that simply means is round 1 needs to be relatively accessible, but also it need not necessarily always be like an immediately difficult, comprehensive, nuanced, maybe even, I would argue, even a matter heavy motion, because those types of motions, most of the time, would involve, very, very specialized information, specialized frames that are very easy to win, um, and are very difficult to execute, which you would not expect a lot of, or most teams to be able to do. So, you set a very relatively easy, good start, round one motion, like this one. This also gets to focus on apocalyptic narratives and climate change advocacy. Here, I'm critiquing this motion right now. Number one, it's a regrets motion with an expectation for a counterfactual. This is something you talk about in the debate briefings, and so you set a motion like this very early on. Number two, you also look at a very, very classic, people usually say it's a chestnut motion, wherein you talk about the exaggeration of climate change and the consequences of that for climate change advocacy. And in some sense, this motion, it talks about the benefits and harms of relying on that strategy. And so here it should be very evident that many teams, even if they're novice, even if they're beginner, are able to make some of these arguments, but there is a requirement, right? If they want to do the argument very well in order to win, then they need to do it very well. And that is a very simple test for a very simple motion in round one, which many high teams should be able to win if they are deserving of being a high team. And so that's the rationale of like round one. Everyone is able to make some argument. Everyone is able to get their, their pedal, their foot on the pedal, and just kickstart the filtering of the tournament into the rooms where they are relatively more competitive and where they would be designated as such. And so, and this is many discussions that usually happen in AdjCores, round one need not necessarily be a deep motion, because again, the variance in the rooms that is expected need not necessarily always be like addressed by a uniquely balanced or very, very, very deep motion wherein you would expect very advanced frames that are needed in order to win that debate. On the contrast, the last round of preliminary rounds, right? The end of the entire prelim rounds where there are bubble rooms that are very, very critical and where it is very, very important to consider, this team has to win in order to break for the tournament. Those decisions are very, very vital, right? So, and the teams are relatively more balanced against each other. And so there are more close contentions in which certain teams, you would want to reward skill in resolving close clashes for them to necessarily win that round. And so that is why you would expect in round 6, you would expect not a basic motion per se, but you are more likely to expect a motion that is balanced, but somewhat characterization heavy and very nuanced. You won't expect a very experimental or a very new matter heavy, super, super, super hypothetical motion, right? And that is because those motions could, go very haywire and they could go very, very, very crazy. You want a concrete, simple, but very, very, very good debate where people are able to demonstrate their skill and win fair and square so that there's no weirdness going on. And that is what would happen in the last round, right? Which is why in this motion we would set this house supports the rise of independent journalism on social media, right? And of course, this is the info slide. You can read this on your own time. It's just about influencers and independent journalists or freelance journalists going online and then making content there. Here, it's across even bubble rooms or middle rooms where, you would expect, like in a tournament like this, like there would be bubble rooms for the novice category. There would be bubble rooms for teams that are in the junior category. There would be bubble rooms, in maybe some junior teams that want to compete in the senior category if they're good enough, right? And so you would expect that they would all be able to make arguments for this motion because it's very grounded. It's very similar to a theme in which is like this house believes that social media has done more harm than good. It's very similar to a theme such as like fake news on social media and the consequences of that fake news and discussions on fact checking online. And there are some characterizations which many teams can also utilize in order to, make those arguments relatively more advanced, such as, the rise of independent journalism is very, very different than just talking about the benefits and harms of social media in general, or even more so, the benefits and harms of independent journalism in particular. And so the difference is, the arguments are still very, very, very like accessible, very, very balanced. You would expect the same themes of arguments on the usual social media has done more harm than good, but you expect it to be relatively more difficult, but also relatively close because it is contingent on very, very, very nuanced characterizations on how that rise would specifically manifest, or what are the specific incentives of independent journalists on social media, and how do different subsets of groups, the target market of those independent journalists, how does that affect existing echo chambers, etc., etc. And so, hopefully, if you guys are thinking about it, right? Round 1, relatively not so deep. Round 6, a lot of potential to go deeper. But the balance and accessibility, relatively still the same, no? So round 6, we still want that balanced motion. We still want a very accessible motion across every room. And that is where, champions are made. And then you move on from there. The second consideration that you would also want to think about would be tournament schedule. Like, how do you imagine debaters going through the tournament with your emotions? Which, of course, is a very, very, it's a tournament logistical consideration, but it's not that difficult to incorporate when you are applying many of the other principles. So, for example, if you are expecting that the end of day 1, for example, would be round 2. And for this tournament in HKDO, we had the round 2 motion, this house regrets the commercialization of Christmas. You think about how they are going through their day. Round 1, they start with social movement, climate change advocacy motion, and relatively about the narrative of that. And round 2, you don't want to, surprise them with, a motion about, Iran or a motion about the Middle East. You don't want to make it like too difficult so that everyone, just gets annoyed and, gets fourth or, gives up on the tournament. You want to find a way to ease them in, make it more motivating. You want to make it possible for them to win. You want to make them feel that it's accessible, that they could make better arguments for the motions that are presented. And usually, these motions at the end of a day, those are the motions where you would likely see, relatively lighter motions. Lighter motions in the sense that everyone can make some argument. There's a relative experimental variety for the motions that they would tackle, so that they could make arguments that are relatively more creative. Because again, people are, they're tired, they're exhausted at the end of a day, they just want to get the day over with, but they're still gonna go through the round. So you want to reward people that have that, that enthusiasm to the end, the persistence through the end, the fighting through the exhaustion. But you also don't want to, beat a dead horse, right? You want to make sure that even those that are very tired, they still want to be able to get a motion that they could debate in. And this motion, it's because it's Christmas. It's an HKDO, and all of us were wearing um our reindeer hats and all of that, and Santa Claus hats. We were quite happy to set a commercialization of Christmas motion because again, it's still relatively chestnut. It's relatively timely, but also still not too basic because the aspects of commercialization compared to the aspects on how do people internalize, you know, the values of Christmas and how they engage with one another, like with respect to, the culture of gift giving, notions on generosity, things like that, or, consumer spending and how they're expected to spend more and more money, aspects of targeted advertising, all that other stuff, right? People are able to make those comprehensive, nuanced arguments, but they don't need to always make those arguments to win the debate. They could just make an argument about why this dilutes Christmas and the value of it. And many rooms could find some engagement and some enjoyment in doing that process. And that makes for very, very good debates. Right? When people are enjoying, they're more motivated, they're more enthused by emotion, they're more likely to participate more in the round. And I think that's quite good, especially if you want to, consider how it affects every room in a tournament. Um, the third thing would be theme diversity, no? Actually, before I say that, I wanted to just note that, you know, this is where some trade-offs happen, right? Round one, round two, you would ask, like, well, why is there regrets motion, consecutively? And then, of course, I would admit, yeah, no, that's an issue. Maybe it's because the way the counterfactual would be explained would be quite different. Like, for example, the first motion, it's about social movements and how they would relatively engage instead, which it feels like it's a very, 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 policy-oriented strategy motion. Whereas the second one, it's like, oh, it's a norm on commercialization, and so feels like the counterfactual is a little bit different. So, I guess as an AdjCore, we were okay with saying that, yeah, you know what, okay to set two regrets motions because we wanted to prioritize some aspects of tournament schedule. We wanted to make some Christmas motion that is relatively economic, but is also relatively values based. So let's like ease in from narrative to go to economics, and you move on from there. Number three, you want to think about theme diversity, which would involve thinking about what are the different issues that you are going to tackle in a tournament. And of course, this is why when you are going through the shortlisting process as an adjudication core, you don't just automatically, approve all the motions that are highest ranked. Because if all the motions that are highest ranked are like, economics, then what are you doing, right? It's just an economics tournament, right? If you want a tournament to really be fair, or I would say accessible, but also very enriching and a good educational experience, then the best debaters, right, are the ones that are able to win across a variety of themes. Soft themes, hard themes, and but also many mixtures of those themes, many intersections of those themes. And so what you want to consider is, well, one, am I having a sufficient balance of soft and hard motions? Am I alternating between them sufficiently enough so that I don't go hard, 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 soft, 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 and it feels too repetitive, and you want them to, engage with different motions immediately as soon as possible. But also you want to think about, well, am I tackling, issues, like the issues itself, in a very, very, very comprehensive way? So, for example, in this tournament, round three, we were like, okay, round one, round two, we've already done some relatively soft motions on narratives, on norms, on even some level of economics, right? That's the soft economics motion on commercialization and how that affects people and buying habits, their lifestyle and the values they have. And now we're like, yeah, now's the time to set a hard motion. We start day two by setting a relatively harder motion, like US politics. And let's make it specifically about, political strategy. And so that's why we set a motion, which was the US Democratic Party should abandon the strategy of Big Tent politics. And then you're like, okay, game, now we need to do something that's a little bit soft. Position it soft, but still relatively difficult, still relatively experimental, still relatively nuanced. And then that's where like, oh, now it's time to set a religion motion. Because if we've already done some soft narrative goo goo gaga motions in round 1, round 2, now we're like, okay, let's level it up. Let's level it up. This is where, people need to be challenged. This is where they need to win some rounds, rack up some points. We will reward teams that are very, very good, that know US politics, and we will reward teams that are very, very good at doing, nuanced discussions on comparatives. And this is where I'm already going to go directly into some argumentative diversity along the way here. So if you notice round 3, Big Tent politics, which is just basically, bringing in traditional right-wing politicians into the Democrat Party when you're campaigning, notice that the explanation of what it looks like and how the US Democratic Party would specifically operate on the comparative, absent the strategy of Big Tent politics, is something that a lot of teams could utilize and weaponize for their benefit, right? When they go into the round, they could explain that, without Big Tent politics, we might double down more on our progressive beliefs. There are incentives to do so. Or it could be possible that the US Democratic Party would, we are just gonna be very moderate within the Democrat Party, but not try and create a bigger tent. Like, we're gonna identify as the moderate Democrat Party and deny any semblance from the right-wing party. And now it's like, yeah, you know what? That is part of the debate. That is a characterization battle. That is also an incentives battle. And a lot of framing could be rewarded to do that. In the same sense, when you think about the issue on how would teams frame this debate, right? You want a soft motion where the comparative is clear, where the frame is now a little bit more, easier for people to access and determine for themselves in the round, so that they could just have a very good debate on providing arguments 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then compare and weigh along the way. And then now, for me, that's a motion like round 4, which is this house supports the widespread adoption of religions that emphasize the doctrines of unconditional love over religions that emphasize reciprocity and social and moral obligations. Here, it's relatively a clear comparative that it is about the way in which we create such doctrine and impose that doctrine within organized religions. And it is about the widespread adoption of those religions across, large swaths of the population. And so that's very rich, no? That's a very rich argument, very, very rich debate where, there could be some aspect of personal identification with that religion. There could be some aspect on, this could lead to a punitive justice system and, people behaving against each other in a very, very, unforgiving way. That's very rich, but it's based on a very clear comparative on what they have to defend, and then the explanation of what that actually means. So that's very, very different from round 3, by the way, because round 3, multiple ways in which the debate could turn out, but also framing is very, very important to be rewarded. Mechanisms, very, very important to be rewarded. Round 4, you reward weighing. You reward, being able to prove a point until its conclusion, and then fulfilling that until the very end. Which is why, there are lots of ways teams could win round 4 as well, but it's not in the sense that a big frame wins, right? They need to engage with the other teams, weigh it in that round, and then characterize the unique nuances, unique mutual exclusivities, and then win from there. Which is why, round 3, round 4, many middle rounds in a tournament, that is usually where you would expect a lot of rounds to go a little bit more haywire. I don't want to go too crazy here, in the sense that, this is where, AdjCores are just, they're just gonna go crazy. But think of it like this. Many tournaments will always have some sense of, you know, you have to take things on your own hands to win, and you can't just rely on the motion, or, you know, expecting that the motion is always going to be like perfectly balanced all the time. Of course, there are some minimum expectations, but the point is, if you need to take risks, and I do agree, risks are very important when you want to advance this community and set more emotions and allow teams to just, just let them win, let them debate, let them do their thing, let them employ their magic. Then middle rounds are the best places. They're the best places to do some level of experimentation, some level of concreteness, some level of framing, some level of weighing, where they are likely going to beat other teams where they otherwise would not have. And if they're a really good team, you're supposed to be able to withstand that because it's a middle round, right? These are still middle rounds where, you're going to have some top room, some middle rooms that are not the best middle room yet or the best top room yet. And we still have to keep on testing and moving on and on and on to go and, see whether you are worthy, right? And so that's what happens, right? You think about argumentative diversity, theme diversity as well. The last thing I want to mention for this video would be you also want to think about the balance across different rooms. So how would this debate pan out in various rooms? I want to talk about this specific debate on, preferring help to buy policies for current tenants as opposed to policies aimed at reducing the cost of rent. Now, why did we set this in round 5? So, of course, this is a motion with a very clear comparative, by the way, where the comparative is we are defending help to buy policies for current tenants, or we are defending policies aimed at reducing the cost of rent. That's a very deliberate decision because we said if you want it to be relatively accessible, then the comparative has to be clear. You can't just have a very smart economics degree to win the debate because, again, high school, novices, under 18, under 16, under 14. So we're thinking, how would debaters address this in, it's round 5, towards the late of the tournament. It's going to be the last round very, very soon. This is a very critical round. If you are in a, many rooms are still alive. So some teams, in a very, very bin room, that could be a novice team that could break in the novice final or whatever. They need to win this round and they need to win the next round. So now it's like the stakes are very high. Round 5 is a very high stakes round. You still got to be a little bit more concrete, a little bit more balanced. And so that is why you want to make it challenging. You want to make it a debate about providing good arguments. And so if a motion like this, help to buy policies, involves creating arguments such as, this is going to be very unsustainable for the government to spend more and more money on paying for the cost of rent, then you should be thinking, that is an argument on cost. The extent of that cost is what will make them win the debate. Now that is very direct, right? You know that a lot of lower teams in the tournament can be able to make an argument about cost. You know middle teams are going to be able to try and weigh it and explain what that would look like. And even in advanced rooms, you know that the cost argument itself and even the extent of cost is actually not enough to win high-level rooms for this motion. Because you would need to expect that they would say that this is a debate about the housing market. This is a debate about trying to avoid financial crisis. This is a debate about trying to, avoid housing inflation. Now, of course, you don't expect a novice team or bin rooms to talk about, those relatively more complex aspects of the debate, like financial crisis and housing inflation. But that doesn't mean the motion should be abandoned entirely. It just means that you gotta make it more explicit what help to buy policies are so that they could make arguments from those specific mechanisms, which is why we made this specific info slide. Because if you're a novice team and you're reading this motion, you would think, okay, why do we need to put a ceiling on a rental price? It is because a landlord would likely want to set that price very, very, very high. And so now it's like, yeah, you know what? I'm willing to set this motion. That's my round 5. We're game with that. Perfectly fine. No problem at all. So that's why balance across different rooms is definitely a very, very good consideration. Sorry, there's one last thing I wanted to mention. The last thing I wanted to mention would be like break rounds. Like, and my consideration for break rounds in a tournament would be, you want the deserving teams to win in the early out rounds, such as if they are teams that are very, very, very good at engaging with at least 2 other teams and beating those 2 other teams fair and square, then you want a motion where it is so concrete that the panel, that the teams don't end up with a debate where, oh, they're so, like, it's definitely the case that a team's gonna end up getting 4th, or it's definitely the case that a team is gonna end up getting 1st, right? You want fair chance and fair debate, fair battle, but fair challenge. That's the mindset with break rounds, early break rounds in particular, because those are the rounds where, you know, it's gonna be top break against like the lowest break, relatively high in variance, but every team could still win. But you don't want them, like, you know, you don't want an underdog to win on the basis of, you know, some sneaky trick in the motion that is just unfair, right? Like, you don't want that in an early out round, because that's just depressing, right? So what you want is that if an underdog team wins, you want that team to win fair and square on the basis of the fairness of the motion, the challenge of the motion that is inherent to it, and you want a very high level team. You know, you don't want to make it easy for them either, and you don't want to also make it very hard for them either. You want to make it fair and square, that if they really are a deserving team, then they should be able to win these early out rounds. And so that's why, you know, when we're setting the, let's say the junior semifinal motion in particular, because this is the junior semifinal or the novice partial semis, which were the early out rounds for this particular tournament, we were like, okay, this one, junior semis, educational charity should prioritize giving resources to students who have greater potential to succeed, as opposed to equalizing resources to everyone. I think it's the greatest time to set like a relatively education chestnut motion, but in a specific context on socio-economically deprived areas. Because there's richness on the context, there is familiarity with the motion, and there is an explanation on characterizing who are these students that are likely to succeed, and what should we value in this debate? Like, what is the weighing that is important? So all of those aspects are, like, I would say it's like all balanced, right? You will win if you characterize all of those things very, very well. And that's a lot of work. And it's a very basic motion, very accessible, but it's not in the sense that it's so basic that closing teams will never have an argument, right? You know that some closing teams are going to be able to make an argument on, you know, when charities focus on giving, you know, on focusing on meritocracy and success metrics on students that are succeeding, it could create pressure on a lot of those students. It could make families behave in a worse way, etc., etc. It could make other students more demotivated. These are things that usually opening teams will not specifically argue if they are fixated on, like, you know, the donation aspect, like people, whether they would buy into giving donations or not, or whether or not this is like gonna be an empowering thing for the entire community. Because, you know, there's a macro, there's a micro aspect. You move on from there. This moves on to, like, yeah, and the same thing applies for novice partial semis, right? It's very clear that there's a very clear comparative, blend in, stand out, and that's why it's again, we're okay with setting like another social movement motion, because it's very well distanced from like the first 2 motions in the tournament. I'll move on to explaining finals motions. So I don't want to go into this rant or thought process where finals motions always have to be like, you know they gotta be hypothetical, they gotta be wild, they gotta be like philosophy, they gotta be like insane and all of that stuff. I mean, what is the rationale why people make finals motions like that? They want to make it like that because they want to reward a team that is brilliant, right? That's really what champions are. Champions are brilliant. They're able to withstand pressure, and they rise to the occasion to give some of the best speeches that that touch our hearts, that really make for a very amazing debate. And that does involve considering the audience, right? That's why finals, you want of people, every finalist to give a potentially memorable speech. You want the audience to also, engage with that finals and, engage with the debate, right? Applaud, have very, very good cheers and all that stuff. You want a good environment, right? That's why usually you won't see boring motions in a final. But the question is, well, do all finals motions have to be like soft philosophy? Well, not really. Not really, right? They could be very good if it's morality and like, you talk about the, like very, very good implications of that. But a lot of finals motions throughout history were also motions that were relatively hard, but also very, very rich. I think the Chennai Worlds motion is a very, very good example, or even the one about Marxist revolution, or even the motion about showing the horrors of war, for example, right? Like it's a medium motion, so it's not necessarily completely soft. So what you want in a finals motion is you want very, very, very good, engaging, deep debates that do not necessarily need to be like super extremely complex, because you don't expect debaters in a final to run like the most complex argument to win, because that's not what's necessary to win, right? You there's gonna be pressure, there's gonna be like nervousness, people are gonna make mistakes in a final, there's gonna be like so many random things that go on, right? Even the judges, you should expect that the judges are not gonna be able to track everything in a final, right? So you don't want a final to be like very, 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 very like inaccessible in like super, super niche particular thing. But you do want it to be something that is relevant, something that is timely, that is very, very, very good. So that's why some of these motions are like very, very good finals motions that have relatively been set over time, but also are very, very, very good for this particular context. Like, for example, the senior finals motion was, this house believes that the fall of Bashar al-Assad will do more harm than good, because everyone in the tournament, especially from the senior category, like the world schools kids, the ones that are very, very, very well versed and very, very, very good, very high level, that's where you're gonna expect that, yeah, we'll reward you if you know about the situation in Syria. Most of you know some aspects of the situation in Syria. There are some aspects from the 2014, archives that we are all aware of. A lot of people make arguments about, military intervention, rebel groups being supported, the divisions within rebel groups, the complexities between, different insurgent groups within different populations in the Middle East, etc., and the cooperation with such regimes. Everyone relatively has accessed the Arab Spring motion before, and you know that that's supposed to be a thing that people should know of. So that's why let's set brilliant motion, more harm than good. That's where people are able to characterize the arguments they want to make, weigh that in the round, characterize the fall, and then they're gonna have to engage with the other things in the round as well. That's a fair debate. That's a debate where it's in their hands if they are going to win or not, right? If they want to explain the comparative, what happens after the fall, and explain the incentives of that, they can do that. They might do that. They might win because they do that. But that's not the only thing that is necessarily always going to win, right? They don't need to give like a complex, thesis paper as to why, every alternative is going to be better. They just have to explain more harm than good and frame that to be the most important in a specific way, and then they win and move on from there. Same thing applies for like a motion like this. Civilizations rather than nation states. It's kind of like the motion I said for PSDC a year back, which is on city states or on nation states. And here it's like, yeah, if we were organized around culture, history, community, these things are necessarily very good, as opposed to forming it around nation, and the sovereignty of that nation, particular identity and things like that. Which is why you're like, okay, game, this is a very, very clear comparative again, but not in the sense that the comparative is like a policy that we defend one thing and then defend the benefits from that. They have to characterize, what does the world look like? Let's imagine the world to be like this. Let's explain that civilizations would have been created in this particular way. You have some potential to run arguments on innovation, which could be weighed as the most important thing. You have some potential arguments to talk about, like, the implications of, global warfare, global power dynamics or whatever. These things make it a very rich debate, a very brilliant debate. And that's why, for a junior category, I'm totally game to set that. Again, this is under 16. And so, that they have, probably done some arguments on community, on like nationalism being excessive and extreme. That everyone has lived through the era of, making arguments about the failures of populism, etc., etc. And so now this is where you want them to do a challenge like this on reimagining the world in this particular way. Say, this is a very good one for Novus Finals that I thought as well. The one that we set in for this tournament was this one, which is this house would appoint technocrats in the governance post-conflict states. It's a very relatively like very good, simple, basic way to set a finals motion for little kids in novice category, because that they did very well, that they did very good throughout the tournament to make the novice finals. They fought through tooth and nail, right? That they are able to make very, very good arguments. And what we noticed throughout this tournament is that even those novice kids are very high level and very advanced in their own particular way, but their of course their difficulty by virtue of their age is that they just don't know enough about the world because they haven't lived long enough, right? That's perfectly fine. That's legitimate, right? You don't expect like like chess grandmasters at the age of 8 to like already memorize all the openings, right? They're just brilliant in some particular way. They do very, very good in the way that they are already habituated to do very good. So let's challenge them. Let's put them up to the test. And so that's why in this last motion, you don't want to set like the senior finals motion, because that's like instant loss, instant bad debate. But you want to set a motion like this, which is if you're gonna set a hard motion, you're gonna set a motion about a particular context, like post-conflict states. I was going to do that. And then you talk about experts, technocrats, and then explain whether experts do more harm than good. They could do arguments on that. They could contextualize how it leads to cronyism if they want to make that specific advanced argument. And the cronyism corruption argument is not too much of a, right, like distrust or democracy, whatever, right, from the public on technocrats and experts. That's not too difficult of a novice speaker to imagine, because they can already see that, yeah, this is similar to like a benevolent dictatorship type of motion, which is usually a very basic training round motion that many novices are already presented to very early on whether or not governments should be set in this particular way. Should they govern in this way or not? So, and of course, we did do an info slide where we said, yeah, you know what? They're an expert in all of these areas. And it doesn't have to be an expert on something, right? Like, we're not going to say it has to be Western consultants, right? Like, that's very difficult for a novice speaker to talk about because they don't know that much about McKinsey, right? But what you can do is that you talk about, or not just McKinsey, but also like, like the, students or professors, consultants from, Western institutions, from international organizations, or even from like, universities that go and help develop economic policy in many nations that are going through a transition. So they don't need to go into that level of complexity because you don't expect them to do that, but you do expect them to talk about what does expertise mean. And that is relatively rich enough for brilliant speeches to be done in a very novice level. So what's the bottom line? This video went a little bit longer than I expected, but what I just wanted to explain in this video is that when you are setting motions and when you're positioning those motions throughout the tournament, it's very important to consider the experience of the debaters and think about what you are rewarding when you set a motion in a particular round, and what are you trading off when you set a motion in a particular round. And are you, for the things that you are trading off, are you compensating for those things later on in the tournament or in other rounds and positioning other motions in other rounds? So that's why, I always want to think of tournaments as it's like slots, right? You can't just set all the motions and then just, that you're happy with that, right? You have to think about what is the big picture and what is the relationship of these motions with each other. Which is why when a motion gets leaked, for example, that hurts. That hurts, man. Because you can't just replace that motion with something else. You have to replace the specific function that motion had in like the entire tournament. And that's where that's really why people like AdjCores are very, very, very careful to not release those motions to the public. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye bye.